To look at meeting our three MPs from the different parties. Joined by Julie Zerowitz. She is in Toronto. She's a Liberal MP for the riding of Davenport. I'm also joined by Brian Massey. He is an NDP member for Windsor West, and he's joining us from Windsor, Ontario. And joining me in the studio is Michael Cooper, who's also the Vice Chair of the House of Commons Justice Committee. All three of you, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
All right, I'm going to start with Michael Cooper, not because he's in the studio, but because as the vice chair of the committee, yours was one of the letters that triggered this emergency meeting, and you were calling for Jody Wilson-Raybould to be called back to appear before the committee a second time. Just go through why this is important for you.
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, some of the testimony from Mr. Wernick and Mr. Butts contradicted that of Ms. Wilson-Raybould, in terms of at least their characterization of some of the interactions that they had with her. So it's important to hear her again, to frankly cross-examine her on some of those points. In addition to that, she has made it clear that there are pertinent communications relevant to the getting to the truth of the matter that she can't speak about at this point in time because the Prime Minister is silencing her in respect of cabinet confidentiality and solicitor-client privilege. Now, I'm hoping that if she's called back, the Prime Minister will then do the right thing and lift it. But thirdly, the Liberals want to have this discussion behind closed doors on Budget Day. Canadians deserve transparency, and if they don't want Jody Wilson-Raybould to be called back, they ought to say so in public before the cameras and vote on it before the Canadian people.
Okay, we're going to come back to some of the specifics that you might want to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould. Let's go to the other opposition member, Brian Massey. On behalf of the NDP, your members also are asking for her to return. Why is it important for you?
Well, we've sensed this from day one, is that when you have testimony provided in different contexts, it becomes very confusing. And I think a lot of Canadians are out there getting these different messages from different timeframes. So Jagmeet Singh has called for a public inquiry. That's the necessary tool. The committee hearings are very important and worthwhile, but you see what's happening here is that we need Ms. Wilson to come back to counter some of the narratives that have then put in place, and they seem to be somewhat organized about her testimony. So there seems to be discrepancy about whether what she said was believable. And then second of all, you have the second part, which is the constrictions of the timeframes imposed by the Prime Minister, which makes it very awkward to say the least, let alone the most important thing is to get some clarity to this. There seems to be two things happening right now. There's the SNC Lavalin scandal itself. The second scandal is procedurally what's taking place in the House of Commons, because I've been there since 2002, and I've never seen such a circus for such a serious issue.
Okay, Julie Zerowitz, as a Liberal, what do you think about the request that Ms. Wilson-Raybould be allowed to appear before the committee again? We did see the Clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, came back to have a second appearance. What do you think of the request?
So thanks, Martin, for the great question. So as you know, I'm not on the committee, and I do think it's up to the committee to decide what they think is the next best steps, and I think that's what they'll be talking about tomorrow. I will point out two things. One is we've already heard from all the key players. So we've heard from Michael Wernick, we've heard from Jerry Butts, we've heard from Jody Wilson-Raybould, we've heard from Nathalie Drouin, and we've heard from the Prime Minister directly on this particular issue. So I think we've heard from all the key players. I think that we have the information out in the public, and I think Canadians are forming their opinions on what actually has taken place.
Okay. As the person that the Liberal Party has put up to speak on this issue to us today, do you think that she should not appear?
Well, I'll say to you that the reason we had Michael Wernick and Ms. Nathalie Drouin reappear again is we want to make sure that they had a chance to testify under the same conditions as Ms. Wilson-Raybould and as Jerry Butts, which was the waiving of the solicitor-client privilege, the waiving of the cabinet confidence, which is very rarely done. And so that's the reason you had a testimony again from Mr. Wernick and Ms. Drouin again. So
okay. I'll put a point.
Whether Ms. Wilson-Raybould talks again, I think that's up for the committee to decide.
Okay, I'll put a point to you because you seem to be abreast of the whole issue, though. You mentioned different conditions. It is also, though, being widely reported, and we watched the testimony that basically Gerald Butts seems to have reinterpreted the waiver, and he says that he's of the opinion that Jody Wilson-Raybould should be able to talk about events leading up to and even surrounding January 7th. So there seems to be also now a new interpretation of how free she should be able to discuss, for example, issues concerning the cabinet swearing in and things like that.
So I'll tell you genuinely, tomorrow I think that the Justice Committee's meeting, it really is up to them to decide what are the next steps for the committee. I will tell you, though, and I think it's important to mention this to Canadians, it is very, very, very rare for cabinet confidentiality to be waived. It's very rare. It's a historic thing to waive, and for very good purposes. We have issues of national importance that we need a safe space for cabinet ministers as well as our Prime Minister to be able to discuss these details. And so I think Canadians need to know that that has been waived in the case of SNC Lavalin. And I do think that everybody takes it very seriously as to whether or not these conditions need to be waived in any other situation.
Okay, I'm going to put your point to someone who sat through the testimony. Michael Cooper, what do you make of the argument that the two of them, Michael Wernick and the Deputy Minister of Justice, had different conditions, so they had to be asked back? But what about Jody Wilson-Raybould?
Well, again, it goes back to an issue of fairness. Mr. Wernick and Mr. Butts were free to talk about the period during which Jody Wilson-Raybould was Minister of Veterans Affairs. They were able to speak about a time that she went to Cabinet after she had been fired. Nothing constrained them if they had something to add. Meanwhile, Jody Wilson-Raybould has one arm tied behind her back. Why? Because the Prime Minister refuses to waive it for Jody Wilson-Raybould. So it's absolutely imperative that he act, but in order to force him to act, we need to get Jody Wilson-Raybould back before the committee. And look, Jody Wilson-Raybould has again and again and again said that there were communications that are pertinent to getting to the truth that she wants to speak about, but there's one person who won't let her, and that's the Prime Minister.
People have said that the Prime Minister, for example, has said that he considered that she had not made up her mind, Jody Wilson-Raybould had not made up her mind whether the issue was closed about intervening in the SNC Lavalin affair. Gerald Butts has said that he didn't think that her decision had been made, whereas Ms. Wilson-Raybould said in her initial testimony that, yes, I had made my decision, I had made it clear to the Prime Minister, and I said, do not interfere with my decision as Attorney General. Do you not think that she should be able to rebut, as Michael Cooper says, that other version of events?
So I will say to you, Martin, that I think Ms. Wilson-Raybould had every opportunity to say anything around the SNC Lavalin case. So cabinet confidentiality has been waived and solicitor-client privilege has been waived for her to say anything relevant to the SNC Lavalin. So I don't think she's been stopped in any way for speaking on that particular matter.
Michael Cooper.
I don't know why.
Examples of what you think she hasn't been able to say.
I don't know why Ms. Zarowitz thinks that she can speak for Ms. Wilson-Raybould, because Ms. Wilson-Raybould believes she hasn't been able to speak to all matters that are relevant. She's made that very clear. So how Ms. Zarowitz can say that is absurd.
What question? So
Mr. Cooper, I'm absolutely not saying that I'm speaking on her behalf. I'm also saying that the committee tomorrow can make a decision. The committee can make any decision about who else it would like to see present in front of its committee tomorrow. And I think that's going to be part of the deliberations tomorrow.
Okay, Brian Massey, we've got your signal back, and thanks for bearing with us. You were saying you want Jody Wilson-Raybould to have a chance to rebut. What kind of things do you think need to be rebutted or addressed by Ms. Wilson-Raybould?
There's two things that are very important. First of all, I want to address the issue over this gift to Canadians about being waived by the Prime Minister being historic. That smacks of the exact arrogance that's a problem at the heart of the matter here. To say that the Prime Minister is going to give Canadians the gift of taking out of the back rooms the politics and the twisting and all the manipulation that's been happening, and then allow this gift of freedom of information is so much arrogance involved. It's really unsettling. And the most important thing that we need to have is an opportunity for people to actually rebut things that have been said about them in their testimony in basically a way that's standard or practiced or at least as predictable. And again, a public inquiry is what's important here, because this is also now about the behaviors of the Liberals and the way that they're actually trying to get this committee to function, because we're not going to have consequences out of this that are any significant. This is potentially covering up criminal activity, and that's unsettling.
Okay, Michael Cooper, one example of another thing you would like to hear where there's contradictory evidence and you'd like to hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Well, I mean, the very suggestion that Mr. Butts made, which was that somehow he and the Prime Minister were in the dark, that certainly seems to contradict what Jody Wilson-Raybould said when she first appeared before the committee. But she said it to the Prime Minister on September 17th, that she again relayed that message to Matthew Bouchard on October 22nd.
That she had made up her mind.
The fact that on September 19th, Natalie Drouin, who appeared before our committee last week, said that Jody Wilson-Raybould made it clear that she said, back off, I've made a decision. So I think in the face of what Mr. Butts has said, Ms. Wilson-Raybould deserves to come back and provide some further context. Okay,
Judy Zerowitz, the last question to you, and that is, as a Liberal, I know you're not sitting on the committee tomorrow, but as a Liberal, can you, as government Liberals, can you afford to not allow her to speak again in terms of political optics?
Well, I will tell you that, and Mr. Massey mentioned this, he says, you know, we have to consider all the consequences of what's actually happened around this SNC Lavalin case. And I want to remind Canadians that the Ethics Commissioner is also looking into and investigating whether all the actors within the PMO has acted above board. And I do think that is a very serious investigation that is going to be underway and will be seriously taken by the Prime Minister, by everyone involved in this particular situation.
Right. But I mean, just cutting to the chase, I guess the question was, though, for the Justice Committee, which is what we're talking about, can the Justice Committee be seen to be shutting this down and not giving her a chance to talk?
As I said, tomorrow it is absolutely up to the Justice Committee to make a decision about who it is that they want to present before them and what are the next steps on this particular situation.
Okay, well, all three of you, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks for taking part, and we will watch with great interest those committee hearings tomorrow. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks Martin.
So much. Have a good day.